Okay. Well, it's been a couple of weeks since you've been able to see my lovely face, so I hope that you've been able to survive without it. But I wanted to get back to part of this class, right, is developing your skills so that you can support literacy in your content areas across the curriculum. And so I wanted to go back to the guide that I've been using and the recommendations on practices in the classroom. Um, Going back to this idea that we know what sort of makes up good reading. And by the time we're working with adolescents, we may have some students that are looking at these different pillars, right? Particularly fluency and vocabulary. We talked about those earlier. And the need to develop background knowledge so that we can build the vocabulary and the background knowledge, and the fluency is just the practice, right? This idea of the more our students read, the better they're going to get at reading and all of that. But really where we're looking at, and from fourth grade on really should be the focus of literacy instruction, especially if the students who have had reading struggles in the foundational skills have gotten the proper interventions and be able to develop all those other foundational skills, would be in comprehension. Because by the time we're working with our students, the expectation is largely that they are learning through reading, right? Not learning to read, but learning by reading. And so that's an important distinction. Obviously, we know that we have students that are going to have problems in the earlier pillars, what we would call the foundational pillars. Generally speaking, as a classroom teacher in the secondary level, we're not really expecting that you're going to be able to intervene to that level. Hopefully those students are identified and getting intensive support, right? Because the gap is closing. So all you can do to advocate for meaningful intensive support for those students, and to encourage schools to continue to identify. Sometimes schools in the secondary level don't even think to look to see if what they have is a word recognition issue. We talked about this earlier, the simple view of reading, and this idea of the word recognition times language comprehension really does equal reading comprehension. So a lot of our work in this area is in language comprehension, but it is important when you have a student that's struggling, it is important for you to advocate for the school system, not you necessarily as a content level teacher, but for the system to have in place a way to identify and make sure that the student isn't actually struggling in the word recognition area. Because remember, a gap or a deficit in either part of this equation will really affect the overall reading comprehension. And anything times 0 is 0. So if in fact the students are not actually at the decoding of the word, well, then you're no matter what kinds of interventions we're going to do, you're not going to get them anywhere, right? However, as a classroom teacher, you're going to be looking pretty solidly over here. So the other model I'd given you was this idea of Scarborough's rope, and this idea that skilled learning, the tying together of these skills that become tighter and tighter so that they become more and more automatic. And so we really do on the secondary level, a lot of the interventions that we're going to look at are on this language comprehension strand. Today, it's really very obvious that it's in that language comprehension strand, because we are going to look particularly at this idea of there is moderate evidence that classrooms that provide extended opportunities for extended discussion about text meaning and interpretation, those classrooms have increased literacy outcomes, increased reading outcomes in those classrooms. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what that might look like within a secondary content area classroom. So just to remind you, these are the other areas that we'd already looked at. So according to the guide that we are using for this, and let me just pull this guide up for you very quickly so that you can remember where this is coming from. Okay, this is the guide, okay, from the IES practice guide. And it is improving adolescent literacies, effective classroom interventions and practices. So I'm using that, and kind of going through that piece by piece with you. But from the guide, it talks about this moderate evidence that they have between opportunities for extended discussions and increased literacy outcomes, And what it says is the theory underpinning discussion-based approaches to improve reading comprehension rests on the idea that students can and will internalize thinking processes experienced repeatedly during discussions. So if I go back for a minute before I forward, oh, sorry. If I go back for a minute here, you can see language comprehension. Really, we're working on things like the students are building background knowledge, they're able to develop vocabulary, and very importantly, they're really looking at understanding verbal reasoning, right? The students are being asked to really interpret the text, but also to share their thinking and explain their thinking. We have a problem though. If in fact this is a good reading comprehension strategy, there's a lot, and this is a conservative estimate, there's a lot of estimates that put classroom talk at being 85% teacher directed. And like I said, there are some studies where it's even worse than that when you look at, going in and doing observational studies and trying to determine what percentage of classroom time is left for that kind of extended student focused discussion. We also know that when we see teachers adding discussions, the IRE model dominates. What is the IRE model? It's initiate a question, have the student respond to that question, and then evaluate that question. So these are questions generally because there's the evaluation process where the teachers are kind of looking for the right word. What happened to this character after this scene? What did the author suggest was the cause of this process, or was what elements were in play when we're looking at the rusting of metal? These are like all the types of questions that would follow where the teacher initiates it, the students respond to it, and then the teacher tells the student whether or not they're right or wrong, on the right track, they're evaluating it. It's a pretty common, and I will admit, even myself, it is something that if you look at your own practices, if you videotape, I encourage you sometime to videotape yourself doing a lesson, you'll see that you probably fall into the IRE. Don't be too hard on yourself, we tend to fall into models of teaching that we saw when we were students, right? So this takes a lot of intentionality on our part, where we move away from this idea that there's a right or wrong answer, and that we as the teacher are kind of there to judge, right? To kind of control the talk that's happening in the classroom. Really what we're there to do is engineer that talk. So we want to move away from this idea of what a classroom discussion looks like to understanding classroom talk on a continuum, and to think about it in terms of learning talk, teaching talk, and interactive discourse, and make sure that we're actually accessing all parts of this continuum. There is nothing wrong with learning talk or teaching talk, but often what happens is we really don't get beyond learning and teaching talk and into interactive discourse. And so we want to think about that. So what is learning talk? Learning talk is the kinds of things, sort of like that last example, where we're asking our students to, we're kind of assessing, we're reviewing, we're making sure the students are learning the content. So those are the things when we ask them to narrate, to explain, question, answer, speculate, imagine, explore, evaluate, argue, justify. A lot of times when we're using those types of STEM questions, we're really just kind of both gauging their learning and trying to fill in gaps where their learning didn't occur, where they didn't get things. So that's learning talk. Teaching talk is something where we're kind of explicitly giving information to the students. So this is when you might recite things, you might list things, you're going to instruct, your direct instruction goes there, you might share your own experiences. So teaching talk and learning talk are both teacher directed. Both are important, especially when you think about things like gradual release of responsibility. Sharing your experience is great for building classroom cultures, right? And so all of those things, I'm not negating the importance of those, but we need to make sure that they don't dominate, that we move beyond those two parts of the continuum into what I would call interactive discourse. What is interactive discourse? It's whole class, it's pupil-led. It is something that can be used both to further learning and some of the learning and teacher talk question stems, but what's important is it's not directed by the teacher. The teacher steps aside offers the opportunity, engineers the opportunity for the discussion, but then doesn't become the center of it. So that's really important that we want to think about. Are we moving away from teacher dominated discussions? So one of the things we want to think about then is, why do we do this? Why are we so worried about this? It's kind of a dumb moment, right? The more time that we take talking, the less time our students talk. And if our students talking is one key to supporting literacy outcomes, improved literacy outcomes, then we want to make sure that we are giving the students opportunities to talk. Why is that? Because the other thing that studies find beyond that 85% of teacher dominated talk, that teacher talk is also on a continuum. It is often rote, it is often recitation, it is often exposition and instruction, it is sometimes discussion, and it is only in a very small part a dialogue. And so if we think of dialogue as a back and forth, we think about things like how we want our students to engage with the texts and with what the author is thinking, then we want to think about whether or not we are using too much of the time to discuss, especially if you're in like a 40-minute period. Wow, that goes so fast. So you want to be really efficient and really think about what you want to say before you offer the students opportunities. So why do we think that this is such an important aspect of literacy outcomes? It's because true inquiry, we go back to that transactional theory of reading. True inquiry occurs when the students are asked to transact with the text. They become a conversant with the text. They're talking to the text. They're not talking to the teacher about the text. They're actually talking directly to the text. And so sometimes the teacher, sometimes we play a role of intermediary to get them to the point that they can talk to the text, but we want to make sure that we're moving out and we remove ourselves so that the students eventually are talking directly with the text as a conversant. And we want to be sure that it's not just that they're kind of regurgitating low-level facts about the text. We want to make sure that the discourse that we're providing offers some sense of tension, because we know that when we have that sense of tension between what we know and what we learn, that learning we construct meaning, we become engaged in it. So we want to allow for things like conflict between the text and the student, right? We want to let the student kind of begin to think about how the text, how it sort of lines up with their worldview or the worldview of others. We want to be able to have that student voice refracting against that author's text, right? And so these are really important. And they're also challenging because now we have to learn how to become comfortable with that kind of tension and conflict and challenge in the classroom, right? It's a lot easier if we stay at the low level facts, right? This involves a lot more skill on our part and a lot more sophistication on our students' part. So we want to think about what might be contributing to these teacher-dominated classrooms, and some of it might just be fear, right? Some of it might be because it's really hard to do it a different way. But I'm going to present this in such a simplistic view because Mikhail Bakhtin is a philosopher who I tried so hard to understand throughout my entire doc program. I think I got snippets of it, so I'm going to share the snippets I have with you. Very complex thinker. But what he has this idea of learning as this idea of this great dialogue. So he talks about dialogue as a circle that shapes our thinking and is shaped by our thinking. In the circle are all the texts as part of the great dialogue. Those both shape our thoughts and have been shaped by the thought of others, including other texts. So when I think about this, like, we are both impacted by what we read, and we're impacting what is being written through our discussions and our experiences. And our thinking is being shaped by what we read, by what other people have shared through the text. So it's a very complicated web. He calls it a circle. I think of it as a little bit messier than a circle. Maybe more of a web would be, an image that I would wrap my head around. But what's important is Bakhtin, when we think about this, in Bakhtin's theory of the great circle of discourse, quality learning then is limited to the quality of student talk, because dialogue shapes our thinking. So if we limit students' dialogue in our classrooms, we limit their ability to be shaped by that dialogue, and therefore we limit their thinking. That is my 5-cent version of Mikhail Bakhtin. If you go to somebody in a philosophy class or a communications class, they're going to be able to give you a much better overview. But I like this idea, or I use him because of the cautionary aspect. This idea that I want to think as a teacher, how might I actually be limiting my students' thinking because I'm not offering up these opportunities? I'm not setting aside time in my classroom for this kind of honest dialogue. We also have to be careful, though, because in order to have our students dialoguing with the text, right, they need to consider authorial intent. They need to make, so that's where our instruction does matter. We need to make sure that the students at least are understanding at a very basic level what the author is saying, right? Because we don't want them responding to assumptions about the author or their own perceptions of the author. We want to make sure that they're responding to the text itself. So yes, there is room and it is appropriate for us to have teacher-directed talk, because that is often the places where we're really working to build their understanding of authorial intent so that we can then step aside and give them an opportunity to interact with the text in a more student-centered discourse opportunity. So what does then the teacher's role look like after we know that they've gotten some basic understanding? They get the text at a basic level, right? They're able to respond to the author. We become discourse guides, which means that our job is to ask probing questions. And I have this example when I was doing my doctorate. One of the comprehension exam questions I had was looking at this idea of discourse in the classrooms. And one of the things that I talked about is the importance of really being able to shape good discussion questions. And so I read this case study of this biology teacher who just, she got into this unit on reproduction, and she really thought that this unit was going to be interesting and that the students were going to be engaged with it. And so she had an essential question for a unit that went something along the lines of, what are the various forms of reproduction, and why has evolution, why have some animals evolved to other forms of reproduction, or something like that. Like, this idea of being able to get them to look at things like sperms, asexual reproduction, all the way straight to, the more advanced reproduction. But what she found was it fell flat. Like, the essential question, not very interested. So she changed her essential question to, is sex necessary for life? And suddenly her 7th graders became very interested and animated by that conversation. When she introduced that in the beginning of the unit, when she kept coming back to it, it was essentially the same content, but it was framing of the content in a way that was a very student-centered and engaging question that then got the students to consider sort of why certain species maybe have evolved or adapted to certain types of reproduction versus over others. And so my takeaway was is that good questions get to the heart of the content, but they leave room for discussion, and they can be linked to the later assessments. So as she's looking at the different forms of reproduction, this question really can guide her students to consider some of the other ways that of reproduction, right? And sort of the advantages and disadvantages from an evolutionary standpoint. So what makes a good question? Good questions need to be authentic. It means that we ask students questions that are open to multiple points of view. They can't be answered simply. You can't go into the text and find the right answer and give it to the teacher and have the teacher in an IRE sequenced questioning strategy tell, yep, you're right, or no, you're wrong, and let's figure out why, right? There's open to multiple points of view. The other thing that we want to think about is that we want to ask questions where the students can be probed to defend their positions by extending their reasoning or inferring information from the text, right? That inferring information from the text is really important because remember, we talked about this idea they want to be conversant with the text. So asking them to dig into the text and use the text to give their students or to extend their thinking, use textual evidence to support what they said, That's really an important aspect of good questions. In the guide that I shared there, the practice guide, they talked about what the steps that a teacher needs to take. And in order for this to be successful, for it to have um, to show that moderate evidence of literacy improvement, we want to make sure that we carefully plan for discussions, which means that as we're preparing to teach, we're thinking about the good questions. We're thinking about the places where the students might have a difficult time getting to the author's intent. We're considering when we are going to step back, right, and allow the conversation to become student-centered. We want to get really good at asking those follow-up questions that help students extend their thinking, so that a student can't just drop a statement into a classroom discussion and leave that. I used to have a colleague who called it, "You're on the hot seat now." He was he was really fun to watch. He was a former attorney, and he went back to school to become a teacher. And the kids would just like laugh at I was in the hot seat today in Mr. Belbus's classroom. And it was really fun to hear them when they got out of the classroom, because what he would do is he would really hone in on a student who made a statement and really kind of ask them to defend that statement using multiple different types of questions. So that's another thing, is to get, why did you think that? Where in the text could you find something to support that? And they want you to, what about, and then asking them a challenge, right? So those following up questions to extend their thinking. You want to provide tasks and structures for students in small groups. We know students being who they are. We know part of the thing I said is it's messier, right? Conversations are messier. So if you ask them tasks, so the literature circles that you did were a great example of providing students specific tasks to and roles within a group. Things like having people be the timekeeper, the reporter, having somebody be the task manager, all of those things, so that they have specific tasks. Maybe before you put students into small groups, you have them write their own questions that they're going to bring to the small group. Maybe you have them respond to your questions, that they have something in writing that they can bring to the group. So it's all about just being purposeful and asking and providing that structure for students, so that they don't get into those circles unprepared with what to do. And then the last thing you want to think about is you want to develop and continue to use discussion protocols. What are the class expectations? What will a classroom look like when how will I know that you are in fact engaging in meaningful classroom discourse? And that's something that you want to consider, and you want to develop those, and you want to keep those in the forefront every time you have your students engage in discussion. All right. Thank you very much. I will be back with another video, but wanted to say hello and hope everybody is doing well. Have a good week.